we've talked about this vicious cycle of environmental driving social issues and social issues driving environmental issues in return. And I suppose that one way to think about this, and it might be getting a little more general and abstract again, is that those vicious cycles can be turned into a virtuous cycle, that empowering these communities will help them maintain their environments and contribute to environmental goals. Supporting those environmental movements will help to strengthen and make these communities more resilient as well. Hopefully can reverse that cycle.
Human trafficking doesn't always take the form we first imagine. It can be found at almost any level of an organization's supply chain. What can compliance professionals do to assess human trafficking risk, and how can they leverage the resources of the organizations they work for to help root out this tragic problem? Gwen Hassan is here to help. This is Hidden Traffic.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Hidden Traffic. This is Gwen Hassan, and I'm very happy to have back as my first repeat guest, Jeff Bond from the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery. He is their Director of Strategy and Design. Thanks for joining me today, Jeff.
Glad to be back.
So today we're going to kind of take part two of the conversation that we started last time, which is we spent some time talking about how modern slavery is impacted by climate change. So the equation kind of being climate change driving modern slavery. And we talked a little bit in that episode about the fast and slow impact of weather changes on modern slavery, but also kind of the industry of clean energy driving in many ways kind of an increase in modern slavery for certain sectors and industries, specifically solar panels and solar panel production. Today, though, I'm looking forward to having you explain the other side of the equation for us. And again, I have to say something that had not occurred to me at all. So I'm really looking forward to learning more about how modern slavery drives climate change, the other side of that equation. So let's jump right in, I guess. So how in the world does modern slavery impact the climate, and what does that look like?
Gwen, you're not alone in not recognizing that relationship. I overlooked it for years as well, but it's not a one-way relationship. We've talked on the last time I was here about how climate change drives vulnerability, but modern slavery is also an enormous source of carbon emissions and environmental destruction more generally. The one stylized billboard style estimate that I've heard is that if modern slavery were a country, it would be the number 3 source of emissions in the world after only the US and China.
Really? Oh my gosh. That's a headline statement right there. The third largest impact in the whole world. My gosh. Mm-hmm. Okay.
When you start to think about the industries and geographies in which forced labor is so prevalent, it starts to make more sense. It's everywhere. So, for example, in Brazil, where there's rampant illegal deforestation, it uses forced labor. And then that forced labor for deforestation is followed by agriculture, in some cases using forced labor, oftentimes using environmentally unfriendly agricultural practices, or it's followed by cattle ranching, which has its own emissions problems, even when done ethically. And you have similar deforestation dynamics elsewhere. In Ghana, it's linked to gold mining. In Southeast Asia, it's linked to palm oil. In Bangladesh, it's linked to the clearing of mangrove forests and shrimp farming. A lot of these, they aren't just bad in terms of emissions. They're also driving habitat loss, biodiversity loss, and other forms of environmental degradation. And so the climate change aspect of it gets a lot of the attention, rightfully so, but so much more than that as well. If you turn to South Asia and Southeast Asia, brick kilns where they use traditional methods to make bricks, they're as notorious for their high rates of modern slavery as they are for the smoke belching from their chimneys. If you've ever flown into some of the cities in some of these countries, you'll see the chimney stacks from the brick kilns all over the place. Another is sand mining, where there are deep human rights issues, also horrible environmental consequences. And these things, they all contribute to what I mentioned in the last episode as a vicious cycle. because you have climate change making populations more vulnerable to modern slavery. And then those populations end up forced to work in the very industries that are causing the climate change that makes them more vulnerable. And so it's this horrible vicious cycle.
The first word that popped to mind for me is pernicious, which is, wow, how do you extricate any part of that cycle? Because we've seen so often in different countries. For example, I immediately think of Democratic Republic of Congo and the conflict minerals issues. And when I say we, I mean kind of the United States and Western kind of countries came in with rules saying, hey, we're no longer going to purchase minerals from these conflict areas. That didn't solve the problem. It drove, in fact, new forms of human trafficking. We now know that there's a whole industry related to heroin production in that part of the world, because when you stop one industry, you're still left with vulnerable people and with opportunistic, manipulative people who will find another way to make money off of the backs of others. So when we think about that climate change circle, you start thinking, well, okay, what's the solution? The solution is we're no longer going to mine sand. Well, okay, then we're not going to have silicone plates that we're going to need to make chips, that we're going to need to make cars and vehicles and airplanes and everything else. So that doesn't seem like it's the solution. Okay, we're going to get rid of all of the brick making kilns. Okay, well, if we do that, then what do all those people do? And they're going to be vulnerable to other forms of trafficking, right? Wow, this is a depressing conversation.
In some of these sectors in particular, they're so hard to address. They're in some of the most remote areas, in some of the places with the least government presence and government influence, perhaps driven by some of the strongest demand in some cases where, as you said, it's not necessarily a luxury good that people are having to forego in these cases. Or alternatively, the demand driving these markets might be a bit disconnected from the global markets that we're thinking of. So, for example, those brick kilns, they're not exporting their bricks to the US and Europe. It's for local growth and development, which generally people think of as a good thing. How do you prove that? You don't want to slam the brakes on some of the growth that is happening here. That's helping.
Yeah, the local empowerment needs to still happen. What is GFEMS doing to try and work on this topic? Is it incremental improvement in conditions in local industries that's the goal? Or is it kind of a broader legislative systemic change, or all of the above?
We're still in the stage of finding out what works, but trying all of the above. I do think that it will be a combination of you have to have the right policies, but you also have to have the enforcement there, which is really a challenge in a lot of these industries in particular. You need the industry transformations as well. A lot of these industries are not going to get themselves to zero modern slavery through efficiency gains. They're going to get there through completely changing the way that they are doing business. Those thinking about the top-down kind of government policy and industry transformation solutions, there's going to be a lot of the community work and work to increase the resilience of communities, increase worker voice and worker empowerment, and to provide justice for the survivors of these crimes as well. So it's everything. I know that sounds like a lot to do, but for pernicious issues like these that are so complex, I think it requires that to reform an entire system.
Well, and that's kind of the reason that GFEMS exists, right? And that Global Fund to End Modern Slavery. I know I'm using the acronym there, but the idea behind it is to be the group that can come in and pull together resources, regulators, countries, NGOs, all of the well-meaning people in the world who are trying to do something here, but in a way that can kind of coordinate efforts and prioritize impact. So thank goodness for you guys, for the fund. I can sleep slightly better at night knowing that the fund is there and working on some of these issues. As we kind of round out this equation, this story, I want to focus for a minute on what the corporate compliance professional can do or should be doing, right? So if we know that it is an entire circle, that climate change drives modern slavery, which then in turn drives more climate change, and it all comes around full circle. Yeah. What can the average corporation do to make a difference, to make a dent? Is it shifting production? Is it technological innovation to come up with cleaner ways to do things? Is it kind of stronger control over their supply chain? Or again, is it one of those all of the above categories? What do you think?
I don't know if we have the evidence yet to say which of those gets us to the goal we need. If there's an 80% solution for 20% of the effort, it remains an all of the above for now. I hope that will change as more evidence comes in. There are a few things that might seem a little too general for the audience, but are also indicative of where we are with addressing the intersection of climate change and modern slavery right now. The first is that you can't solve one without the other. You can't solve the climate change problem without addressing modern slavery. Those stats about if modern slavery were a country, how it would rank in emissions, that's the proof of that. Traffickers are already breaking the law. They aren't going to care about some new environmental policy if it doesn't have teeth. They've shown that they'll just ignore it anyway. They're already doing illegal stuff. And the policies, they really need to have teeth. These are not nice, reasonable people that we are talking about here, especially in some of the pernicious industries. This point may be more directly relevant to policymakers and authorities, but I do think it relates to my next point, which is more important for the corporate listeners. You can't neglect any of the letters in the SG. We talked about this on the last session. And of course, we've talked a lot already about the intersection of environmental and social. While we haven't talked about it directly, the G, governance, is just ever present in these issues. I feel that corruption is so overlooked in discussions of modern slavery and human trafficking. Because whether you are a corporate or a country, your strengthened environmental and social policies are just not going to be effective if they're undermined by corruption.
That's something that is solidly within the wheelhouse of every compliance practitioner too.
Yeah.
It's something that is on everyone's list. Is a good, they call it ABAC, right? Anti-bribery, anti-corruption program. Please give us some more detail about how those fit.
They need to be more prominent in the discussions.
Okay.
So mobilize your listeners to get behind the momentum that I think is there for the discussion, this intersection of corruption and modern slavery. Because just as for today and on the last session, we've talked about the intersection of climate change and modern slavery, there is an emerging recognition of the need to address the intersection of corruption and modern slavery. And that should, I would think, would be really exciting for a lot of your listeners because, again, it calls for the skill set and the solutions that you have. I think it's such an untapped area. I'm certainly excited about it. Finally, we've talked about this vicious cycle of environmental driving social issues and social issues driving environmental issues in return. And I suppose that one way to think about this, and it might be getting a little more general and abstract again, is that those vicious cycles can be turned into a virtuous cycle, that empowering these communities will help them maintain their environments and contribute to environmental goals. Supporting those environmental movements will help to strengthen and make these communities more resilient as well. Hopefully can reverse that cycle.
I love that idea of a virtuous cycle. That's fantastic. I'm stealing that. That's great. That is a good goal for any ESG program, right? Is to create and be part of the development of a virtuous cycle, not just in climate change, not just in modern slavery, but in kind of corporate citizenship overall, right? Making sure that the corporate resources and dollars and supply chain, for that matter, are virtuous and are driving positive social change, positive change in climate, positive improvements in the stakeholder power that their different members have within their organization, whether it's the public or employees or suppliers or all of the above. So that's great. Thank you so much for joining me again, Jeff. I feel like I should come up with some kind of pin or, small desk toy to signify first repeat guest because it's big over here. The first one to come twice. So thank you very much.
Oh, well, thanks. It's been really fun and would be happy to go for the three-peat sometime.
Oh, then we have to get you like an SNL type jacket or something. I don't know. I have to work on it. But thank you again for joining us. And I really appreciate your insight into this fascinating cycle that I was completely unaware of until talking to you. So I really appreciate your guidance and think the listeners will find this really insightful as well. So thank you.
No, thank you. And I love the podcast. I love what you're doing. So thanks for that.